everybody, Jimmy Smith. I'm back with my YouTube channel. One thing I got asked a lot is, why'd you stop making YouTube videos? Why did you stop doing it? With SiriusXM and Unlocking the Cage, where I started like 4 years ago, whatever it was, I was talking about MMA by myself in this room for 3 hours a day. And what I found when it came to my YouTube is I was just repeating myself. I was saying stuff for 3 hours and then having to come back and say it again. And it was just exhausting, the idea that I was constantly saying the same thing over and over. And to do a 3-hour show with energy takes a lot out of you. And if you've ever heard the show, I put a lot of energy to it. It takes a lot out of you. They've changed the programming for Unlocking the Cage, so I'm moving from 5 days a week to Monday and Friday, like post-fight and pre-fight. So I have a lot more free time now. So I figured I'd start delving into things here on my YouTube channel that either mean a lot to me, or the format of radio on SiriusXM is everything's in 15-minute chunks, right? A segment is 15 minutes. You can make it longer, a little bit shorter, but it's in the 15-minute range. And there's certain things I just want to talk about a little deeper, or have the ability to expand on a little bit. And so, anyway, that's why I'm restarting things at the moment. So what I wanted to start off with was something we've been discussing the last few weeks with Jim Miller fighting at UFC 300, is Jim Miller's place in the Hall of Fame, and if he deserves one. Also, while we're at it, the Diaz brothers, Michael Bisping saying the Diaz brothers should be in the UFC Hall of Fame for sure. So I have strong opinions about all of these people in the Hall of Fame. And first off, I want to start out with, what is the Hall of Fame for? Any Hall of Fame. NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball is widely considered the hardest one they're going to do because of the history. But what is it about? And I don't know how you get around this definition of extended greatness. You have to be great for a long time. Now, the definition of what is great and what is a long time is part of, the debate about who gets into a Hall of Fame at a particular time for a particular reason. But that should be the criteria. You were great, and you were great for a long time. Buster Douglas should not be in the Boxing Hall of Fame. He had one great fight, and that was it. He did not have, by any account, a great career in terms of Hall of Fame. The most controversial entries into the Boxing Hall of Fame for the boxing heads, which I am one because I've been in it for a long time, Boom Boom Mancini and Arturo Gatti. The reason is both guys were sentimental fan favorites, loved them to death. They had exciting fights. I don't think they were great for a long time. They weren't. I would argue they wouldn't have great performances against great fighters. They didn't have that. And also, which we will get into about MMA, when you saw Boom Boom Mancini and Arturo Gatti, which I did when I was a kid, Arturo Gatti when I was kind of an adult, but the idea that when they fought that step-up talent, you saw the difference. Right? When you saw Alexis Arguello, Boom Boom Mancini, you went, oh, that guy's great. Boom Boom Mancini is a pretty good boxer. Alexis Arguello is a Hall of Fame great fighter. And you saw the disparity. When you saw, Arturo Gatti take on Floyd Mayweather and Oscar De La Hoya, and you went, oh, okay, those guys are great. This guy's good. And those fights, by the way, especially the Mayweather fight, is hard to watch. It's at one point Jim Lampley says this is humiliating, and it was. So that's what I mean about Hall of Fame greatness, is when you look at, in their prime, Hall of Fame greats, nobody made them look like fools. And I think that's a big part of it, is you saw the difference in level between true greatness and somebody, man, I really like that fighter, but they're not truly great. So backing up a little bit further, when you look at the UFC, and we're talking about modern winning, by the way, the only fighter in the modern wing who wasn't at one point the greatest fighter in their weight class is Cowboy Cerrone. Now, Uriah Faber is the only one in the modern wing who didn't win, along with Cowboy Cerrone, who didn't win a title in the UFC. But he was a 145-pound champion in the WEC back when the UFC didn't have the 145-pound weight class. So there was one point where you could say Uriah Faber was the best 145-pounder in the world until he lost to Mike Brown. So even though he was a UFC champion, they didn't have that weight class. You could argue that he was the best in the world at that weight class at that time. The only one you can't make that argument about is Cowboy Cerrone. As soon as Cowboy Cerrone got into the Hall of Fame, I went, there it goes. I thought, oh, man. And that, I like Cowboy Cerrone. I'm a big fan of Cowboy Cerrone. But when he fought for a title, much like Boom Boom Mancini and Arturo Gatti, you saw the difference. This is a guy who just did not perform well in big fights. When the lights were on and it was a title eliminator or something big, and obviously you fought Rafael dos Anjos for a title and just got destroyed. Fought Conor McGregor. And I don't think a prime Conor McGregor. He got destroyed. He had trouble rising to the moment. And when you look at all-time greats in any sport, they rose to the moment. We're about to see, of course, the Chiefs go to the Super Bowl again. Patrick Mahomes. Why is Patrick Mahomes great? And probably a future Hall of Famer if he keeps doing what he's doing. In the playoffs, that's when the guy's the best. And you don't get Joe Montana isn't Joe Montana if, man, in the Super Bowls, he just never really got it together. And so when Cowboy Cerrone got in, I went, that opens the door for what I call, the sentimental favorites. The guys that, boy, I really like that guy. The Arturo Gattis, the Boom Boom Mancinis, who, man, he was really entertaining. I don't know if true greatness was within his grasp even in his prime. So as soon as Cowboy Cerrone got in, I went, okay, now it's going to be the floodgates of guys that I really like, but weren't necessarily great. And I put Jim Miller and the Diaz brothers solidly in that category. Now the reason is, a lot of people, the debate is about longevity. Right, where Jim Miller has every longevity record in the UFC, right, for the weight class and for most time, most fights, most this, all the mosts belong to Jim Miller. That's when I go back to extended greatness. Did he have the extended part? Did he have the time part? For sure, not at the elite level. And the problem with that is when you look at other stick and ball sports, right? I know it's an apples to oranges comparison, but if you look at the NFL, I got my Pittsburgh Steelers hoodie on. But when you look at the NFL or Major League Baseball, you just can't be in the major leagues for 20 years and not be a damn good player. You're almost a shoo-in. If you're a starting quarterback for 20 years, you're almost a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame just because you don't stay in the NFL for 20 years if you aren't great. Sure, you can be a kicker or a long snapper or something like that. That is very, very niche and fine. But that's not what we consider greatness. If you're a running back for years and years, you're just going to accumulate numbers that are going to get you in the Hall of Fame. There's no such thing in, obviously there are backups, but there's no such thing as a quarterback that we take out of the game when we play playoff teams. When we go to playoffs, we use a different quarterback. It doesn't work that way. So there's a level that you have to maintain in order to be great in pro leagues. In the UFC, you can be in the middle ground, fighting fight nights, not that expensive, making a lot of money on your post-fight bonuses for a long time. The difficulty I have for longevity as a criteria all by itself is it's kind of up to the UFC how long you're there. If they want to give you the John Fitch treatment, who never lost back-to-back fights in the UFC and got cut after he lost to Damian Maia, if they had given John Fitch, you can be a gatekeeper. He could have been a gatekeeper in his prime for a long time. Long time. So the idea that Jim Miller is where he is and has that longevity because he's in the mid-level and they're content to keep him there and he's content to be there and isn't probably going to fight for a title. He won't fight for a title with what he has left in his career. So it's kind of up to that third entity, the UFC. Right? There's your opponent, and then there's the UFC. And if the UFC decides to keep you in the mid-level, you can fight for a long time. So the whole, man, you did it for a long time, yes, but a lot of fighters just aren't allowed, which Jim Miller did, lose 4 fights in a row, the longest losing streak of his career. Most guys get cut after that, and he didn't. So they kept him around and said, okay, you're a mid-level guy, and that's where he's been, and he's been a sentimental favorite, and he's been having entertaining fights. That's something you can't do in other sports. They don't just keep you around because, man, fans really like you, so we're going to let you come in for certain plays sometimes. It doesn't work that way. So that's the problem I have. When you look at the welterweight, another guy who has every, longevity record for his weight class is Neil Magny. Not a great fighter, never fought for a title, is never going to fight for a title, has been in the middle ground for almost his entire career. Only a couple times when, maybe he'll break through and be a contender. Never really got there. He has every longevity record. Who has a knockout record in lightweight division? One of the most storied divisions in UFC history. Drew Dober. Just lost, by the way, to Renato Moicano. Not a great fighter. Good, just really good. And as long as he's continuing to chug along, he can add to that knockout record. That's the difference in the UFC. Is if you're allowed to just keep going, okay, plenty of guys can just be on a fight and have all of those longevity records without ever truly being great. They'll get one side of the equation and not the other. And that's where I put Jim Miller. Is he has the longevity part of it, but it's all been at the mid-level. His longest winning streak was 7. He won 7 in a row in the UFC. He came in, he won 2, he lost to Gray Maynard, and then he won 7 in a row. Let me go over the 7. It started at UFC 100, actually, in 2009. Mac Danzig, Steve Lopez, Dwayne Bang Ludwig, Mark Bocek, Gleison Tebow, and early Charles Oliveira. If people have been in the game long enough, there's like pre-Charles Oliveira, there's now Charles Oliveira. 2 different guys. He beat pre-Charles Oliveira by knee bar in 2010, and then Kamal Shaloruz. Biggest win streak of his career. When you look at those names, other than Charles Oliveira, which I think is the best one of his career, those guys had great careers. Dwayne Ludwig, talented striker. Mac Danzig was good, not great. Mark Bocek, great grappler. When he got to that next level, he lost to Benson Henderson, Nate Diaz, Cowboy Cerrone, Benil Dariush, Michael Chiesa, Diego Sanchez. It's as soon as it was the Benson Henderson loss was kind of the high water mark of his career. If he had won that, would have fought for a title. Then he loses once again. Fight after that, he beats Melvin Gillard. Then he loses to Nate Diaz. He never really gets back to that streak where you thought this guy could be something special. This guy could fight for a title. Once again, really entertaining, fun fighter. I really like Jim Miller. He's a really nice guy. But when you look at what a Hall of Fame is for, that extended greatness, which is the hallmark of a Hall of Famer, the extension part is there. The greatness is not. And after the Benson Henderson fight, I don't think he ever recaptured that kind of momentum. The Diaz brothers are, in some ways, they did have a and this is what Michael Bisping talked about. He talked about what they did for the sport. Like, man, what they did for the sport, they should be in the Hall of Fame. I disagree in that plenty of people have a crossover celebrity or, Roger Huerta did a lot for the sport, being the Sports Illustrated cover boy. He was never a great fighter. You can get caught up a little too much in what they did for the sport or how popular they were, how much people loved them. And, okay, once again, extended greatness is what the Hall of Fame is about, not, boy, fans really liked him. Great, wonderful. That's why they made money. That's why they are as popular as they are, and that's great. But I think the Hall of Fame is about rewarding in octagon or in ring or on the field performance. My example is always Carlos Monzon is in the Boxing Hall of Fame 2 years after he murdered his wife. He gets into the Boxing Hall of Fame. The guy would not get any awards for anything he did outside of the ring. All right, so the Hall of Fame is about what he did in the ring. Now, you could argue you shouldn't even have that, having murdered somebody, but you get my point. You can only get caught up so much in outside of the ring. They were humanitarian, and they were this, and they were that. All right, it's great, wonderful. The Hall of Fame should be about, all right, what did you do in this particular sport? So when it comes to Diaz brothers, what I find interesting, Nate is very much, to me, in the same category as Jim Miller, a guy who just kept on chugging and did fight for a title against Benson Henderson. But once again, people forget he fought for a title one time against Benson Henderson and just got wiped out. He didn't win probably 2 minutes altogether in that fight. It was one-sided. And one thing I always remember about that fight, watching it live, they kept going to a wide shot of the arena because Nate kept flipping off Benson Henderson. They had to cut away. And like over and over again, I'm going, what the hell are they doing? I'm like, oh, he's flipping him off. Anyway, but you saw once again the difference. This guy is champion, and Nate just wasn't there. And the problem throughout Nate's career is his takedown defense. He relies on his jiu-jitsu to save him, where I'll go to the ground and I'll pick you off. Well, as guys got better and their defensive jiu-jitsu got better, that didn't work as effectively. And both Nick and Nate had kind of the same problem. They generally lost to wrestlers. Although Nick did, obviously, in the last one he got outstruck by Robbie Lawler. I don't even hold that against him. Shouldn't have been in that fight at all. Joe Diesel Riggs. People remember he lost to Joe Diesel Riggs? Nick. So Nate has been in the UFC for a long time and is in that Jim Miller category where fought a lot. His record 16-11, I think. So 16-11, been a mid-level guy. Yes, he beat Conor McGregor. That kind of elevated his status. But beyond that, the signature wins aren't there against a really elite talent. I don't believe Nate belongs there. Once again, one title shot, and we saw what happened with that. Much like Cowboy Cerrone, we saw the difference. Nick is a really weird case because, guys, he doesn't have a winning record in the UFC. He's 7-7-1. With the loss to Anderson Silva, he's really 7-8-1. It got overturned. That's the one no contest in his career in the UFC. 7-7-1. Doesn't have a winning record. How, Michael Bisping, does Nick Diaz get into the Hall of Fame without a winning record in the UFC? In the modern wing, of course, with the pioneers, because Sakuraba was 1-1 in the UFC, in the Hall of Fame. But against the same guy, Conan Silveira. But this idea that he doesn't even have a winning record, he should be in the Hall of Fame. Also, I think people forget that a lot of his career or a lot of his success or notoriety came outside the UFC with what he did in Strikeforce, right? Choking out Takanori Gomi in Pride. And he did things outside the UFC that kept his flame burning really bright. In the UFC, even in the beginning, his debut was against a guy named Jeremy the Scorpion Jackson. They had fought twice outside the UFC, and then their rubber match was in the UFC. It was the debut. He won by armbar. Knocks out Robbie Lawler, but then he's just up and down. Loses to Carl Parisian, loses to Diego Sanchez, beats Kojo Ishii, loses to Sean Sherrick, He was up and down in that early run. When he got cut from the UFC, nobody really thought much about it. It was okay, and then he came back. He won a couple back-to-back. Josh Neer, Layson Tebow. I'm not looking at it in front of me. And then built up his career in Strikeforce, right? Had the war with Paul Semtex Daly and all that stuff, and fans loved him. Beats Frank Shamrock and all that stuff. And then comes back to the UFC, beats BJ Penn, a puffed-up 155-pounder, doesn't win again. Fights for a title against GSP, didn't deserve that. He lost to Carlos Condit. And once again, we return to this. Against GSP, we saw the difference. He just wasn't competitive in that fight. Now, GSP is an all-time great. He's, that's a Hall of Famer. And we saw the difference. And that's a theme I keep going back to is, you saw the difference between greatness and the Diaz brothers when they were in that position. And so Nate finished off his career, hopefully, I really don't want to see him come back, with the Robbie Lawler loss. But he came back, beat BJ Penn, and didn't win again. So I don't see it. If you believe the Hall of Fame is about how fans gravitate toward you, once again, we'll get into all these names that were far less than great, but fans really liked them. Should Tank Abbott be in the Pioneers wing? Even in the Pioneers wing, well, they're letting guys that, didn't have great skills at Tank Abbott. Despite, he was really, fans really liked him. Maybe the Pioneers wing, you get away with it, but you start opening that door to how did I or fans feel about this person? Rather than, were they great? And were they great for a long time? Which I think is the number one criteria for the Hall of Fame. And by that criteria, the Diaz brothers and Jim Miller, to me, don't qualify. And I don't see how, with the amount of time these guys have left in their careers, I think Nick is done, get there at any point. I don't see it. Once again, big fan of these guys. Love watching them fight. Grappled against Nick back in my jiu-jitsu days. Like they're great, really fun fighters to watch. But there has to be a separation between, man, I really like him, and man, they're all-time greats. Jim Miller, gonna love his fight at 300. I hope he, keeps going and keeps adding to, all of his mosts that he has in the UFC. He's always fun to watch. I don't want to see him go to the point where obviously he ends up having a tough time in his retirement because his body and brain don't have it anymore. I don't want to see that. But the idea of being entertained by Jim Miller's fights, I still am, still love watching him. But the Hall of Fame, I think he just has longevity. And to me, longevity is enough. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'll be posting more of these. Appreciate you.